All right, welcome again tonight to another edition of Fight for Justice. In our earlier show, you may have caught, we talked about divorce and we went through some of the processes and procedures. Tonight, we're going to continue that discussion, dealing with issues that are implicit in any divorce action, or can be, including alimony and child custody and those kind of issues, support issues. Now, I want to talk for a second about legal separation as opposed to divorce. Divorce is when you are getting a complete separate from your spouse. That is, you're divorced, you no longer have any obligation. But legal separation is a little bit short of that. Freeman, tell us, audience, what legal separation is, if you would.
Legal separation doesn't end the marriage. It just actually basically calls a timeout. And you are legally separated. Everything separates, but the marriage is ongoing. Typically, this is done for insurance purposes. It's been my experience that, for instance, health insurance you cannot continue to have an ex-wife on your insurance after your divorce. So some people, if they have a sick spouse, husband or wife, they will go the legal separation route instead of divorce in order to keep their spouse insured in that instance. Okay,
and if you have a legal separation, and let's say that one or both of you meet somebody else you want to get married to, what do you do about that?
You then have to go get a divorce.
And what is the process? Same one as before?
It's the same process. Getting a separation doesn't bar you from filing a divorce later on. You can also take care of future obligations in a separation, such as property, things like that.
So you're kind of partially divorced, aren't you?
You're partially divorced.
Yeah.
Some people, like I said, either use them for insurance purposes or basically as a timeout to make sure that any accumulation of assets that's happening during the marriage stops.
I've had some people want a legal separation because they want to see really whether or not they really want a divorce. So they get a legal separation. It tells them where they are on support issues and things like that. And then they may come back and go through another ceremony to get remarried, or they may proceed with a divorce, whatever they want to do. But you're right, that's typically a reason. Now let's go back to the issues of alimony in a divorce case. Most of the time it's the wife who seeks alimony, and sometimes it can be the husband. Say the husband's disabled, he can also receive alimony. So we've got a chart up on the screen.
If I could stop you there,
yeah.
That's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the case, and it's less and less frequently the case now. The man doesn't have to be disabled, but you can have, now, either the wife can be a doctor just like a man. If the woman in the relationship makes a lot more money than the man, then the man will seek alimony just
that's what I said.
Like
the man can seek it. Either party can seek alimony. Depends on the circumstances. But whoever seeks it, let's go over the elements, things considered by a court as whether to award alimony. Let's talk about those.
Typically, like we have up here on the slide that's on the screen for the audience, alimony is awarded to either party for need. It's done either temporarily, pending the final decree. So that means you can have alimony awarded temporarily while the divorce is going on, and then it can be made, final through a divorce decree. It can be made to either spouse, but the spouse has no separate estate.
And that means what? That they don't have their own assets or own income.
Correct.
Right. Okay. What else?
The fourth reason that it would be awarded is excluded from alimony as property acquired prior to marriage and inherited property not used regularly for the benefit of the marriage. This is a question that I get a lot from clients and friends even. They always want to know about when the clock starts ticking on a marriage and whether their inheritance can be touched. Typically, marital property begins from the day you get married. So if you don't have anything the day you get married, then anything you acquire after you get married, will be subject to the court and will be considered marital property. Inheritance is different. You can inherit money or property And as long as you don't use that for the benefit of the marriage regularly, then the spouse cannot touch that later on. Alimony is awarded for misconduct of one spouse or the other. Unemployment is not a determining factor, rather the capacity to earn is a factor. And that basically would mean that you can have someone with a master's degree who is unemployed, and that's not going to be as big of a factor as the court could consider the fact that he does have this master's degree or he is highly educated, and it would be easier for him to go get a job than it would be a normal person. 7, periodic payments automatically terminate upon remarriage, open cohabitation with the opposite sex. And that basically means if you are awarded alimony, whether it be periodic or even permanent monthly payments of alimony, they end the moment you get married or cohabitate with another person of the opposite sex. 8 would be retirement income. Yeah. And that just basically means if, for instance, if you work at the depot or you work for the state or you work in a company that has a 401k matching plan, or if you just happen to set aside your own retirement money, then that can also be taken into consideration.
You mentioned periodic. Can you explain the difference to our audience, the difference between periodic alimony and lump sum alimony or gross alimony?
A gross alimony payment would be much more like a property settlement, where it would be one lump sum payment of this amount of money that would be paid. You can set it up in installments, but it's not going to be over a period of time. It's going to say, here's a lump sum of alimony for this amount of money, and that's it. Periodic alimony will be done over time, so that would be more like a monthly payment where you pay your spouse a set amount of money, whether it's a few $100s or a few $1,000s per month, yeah. And that would continue on for, it can be a definite period of time. If you have a shorter marriage, the court can say that you have to pay alimony for a period of 6 months or a period of 2 years.
Commonly called rehabilitative alimony.
That's correct.
Designed to help somebody get back on their feet.
That's correct.
All right. Now, what are the 2 important aspects of the alimony have to do with tax reasons? If you have periodic alimony, can you deduct that if you're the payer? Can you deduct that from your tax return?
Periodic alimony, yes.
How about lump sum alimony?
I don't believe you can deduct lump sum alimony.
So now one other important aspect of what kind of alimony it is whether or not you can modify it down the road. Either party has a right to modify certain things in a divorce decree, up or down. So can you modify periodic alimony?
Yes, periodic alimony will be much like child support. If you have a change in circumstances, if you lose your job or you're not making as much money, you can go back to the court and ask for that payment to be lowered.
All right.
And vice versa, if the other person is making more.
How about
lump sum cannot be done. That's a property settlement. Once you give that money, that's final.
Okay. When we come back to the next segment, we'll talk about other factors in awarding alimony. See you in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to this next segment. We were talking about alimony. Let me just add a comment to the reasons that the courts look at to grant alimony or not, or the basis for it. Anybody who has to pay it, periodic alimony lump sum doesn't like it, so they want it to be deductible at least, because it can save them a lot of money on their taxes. For example, if they're in a 50% tax bracket, and most people aren't, and they pay $1,000 a month periodic alimony, it really only costs them $500 because the other is deductible on their taxes, and it saves them that much money. And likewise, modifications down the road are another factor in considering, as we talked about earlier. You can modify periodic alimony if a man is required to pay it, and as Freeman mentioned a minute ago, the wife might be a doctor and the man might be a yard keeper, and she's probably going to have to pay it if the circumstances are there that justify it. But if the doctor becomes disabled, then he or she can file a request with the court to eliminate it or reduce it. and it's based on the circumstances at the time of the motion is filed. Now let's go and talk a minute about the factors that a court uses to decide whether to award alimony or not. Now we got a slide we can put up. Freeman, talk about what a court looks at in determining whether to award alimony.
Well, the first factor is the age, sex, health, and station in life of the parties. The second, and probably most important, will be the duration of the marriage. Obviously, the longer you're married, the more likely you are to be able to receive either rehabilitative alimony. Usually it's going to be somewhere. There is no set standard, but typically it'll start to be a possibility for you if you're somewhere around the 10-year mark. And then permanent alimony will start to be a possibility for a party somewhere around the 20-year mark. The court also looked at the third, the grounds of the divorce, which we talked about earlier, which, like for instance, adultery could make it much more of a possibility for a party to receive alimony if they're. And
it affects the amount too.
It absolutely can. The fourth is the party's income and means of support, which, if you, like we talked about earlier, if you have a doctor and the other party isn't working, then alimony becomes much more of a possibility for the party that isn't working. 5, the children depending on custody can also be taken into consideration by the court. And then on the next slide we have number 6, provisions for child support, which would be the amount of child support one party is paying to the other. 7, separate estate will not prevent alimony, which basically means that just because a husband or wife may have money stashed away somewhere else that's separate, that doesn't mean that they can't receive alimony if the court determines that they should be. 8, earning capacity, and that kind of goes into the example I used earlier, talking about someone that's highly educated and has the capacity to earn but may choose not to. And that can be taken into consideration. 9, whether parties are self-supporting, which would mean, are both parties capable of supporting themselves? Are they disabled in some way? Are they uneducated and can't make enough money to support the type of lifestyle that they've become accustomed to, or support the children in a way that the children have become accustomed to? All of these factors can be taken into consideration by a court in deciding how much, or if any, alimony should be paid to either party.
So whichever side you're on, you're going to try to present the case that either favors awarding an alimony payment or not.
Absolutely.
Now, one thing we ought to mention here, that in Alabama, judges have a lot of discretion about what goes on. About the only thing that's automatic is they'll give you a divorce, and the child support payments we're going to talk about in a minute are fixed by schedule. They can be deviated from. But everything else is on the table. And as Freeman mentioned to you, Alabama, I don't think we said this specifically, but Alabama is not a community property state. It's an equitable division state. And can you explain the difference between those two concepts?
The difference, the easiest way, I guess, to explain the difference is, for instance, in California, it's a community property state. It's presumed that everything should be split 50-50.
Now, you're talking about property acquired during the marriage.
That's property acquired during the marriage. Here, we do not have that. It's not presumed to be that way. You're going to look at the fault of, if there is some, of each party and take that into consideration when deciding, whether it's going to be a 50-50 split or if it's going to be a 75-25 or 60-40 or whatever the judge decides.
Yeah, but also the wider the split, say one party got 90%, one party got 10, that's probably not going to stand up.
No, that can be appealed, and that's not going to be equitable in nature.
Yeah, but and in the final analysis, it's up to the judge to decide most of these issues, and they have wide discretion. As long as they don't go out and become some crazy result, then it's probably going to stand up. And we're going to talk about the appeal process in a second. But anyway, judges don't have to do, by the way, I should say this, when it comes down to community property, which is 50-50, as Freeman mentioned, the longer you've been married, the more likely there is to be a 50-50 split anyway. So if you've been married 3 years and the husband has most of the property, he's probably going to keep most of it. But he may have to pay some rehabilitative alimony. And there can also always be an agreement between the parties to settle the case. And the shorter the marriage, the more likely you can reach an agreement. But the longer the marriage and the physical health of one party or another, the more contentious it gets. And in every divorce case that we do, we always run into a lot of emotion. It can be hatred, there can be resentment, there can be backstabbing, usually there is. There can be people who kind of embellish the stories that they have to tell. But anyway, that's what they've got to do. It's our job to present the information on whichever side we're on, so that the judge has as much of the information as she needs, or he needs. It happens to be 2 female judges here, to decide what's an equitable result, either in property settlements, property division, alimony, child custody is really a more important issue in every case where that's in contention. Anyway, we're going to go over in a minute and talk about child custody, which is usually the most contentious part of any divorce case. If there's a lot of money involved, we've had cases that have millions of dollars, and that usually means it's going to be a pretty hard-fought battle over who should get what, who should get control of what. But when it comes to children, there's no doubt that if both parents want that child, there's going to be a battle. And that raises the cost of the divorce as well. So in our third and final segment tonight, we're going to talk about child custody, the issues involved, how they calculate child support. See you in a couple of seconds. Welcome back to our third and final segment of tonight's show, and we've been talking about divorce tonight, the second half, the 2-part series actually. Our first show was on it, and then this second one's on the other issues involved. This third segment, we're going to talk about one of the most hard-fought battles in every divorce case, besides property and support, it's the children. Now, what's happened in the last 10 years or so, there has been a movement away from what we call standard visitation, which we're going to get into. But generally speaking, one parent or the other will be given primary custody of the child, and the other parent will be given rights of visitation, or secondary placement, sometimes called. Now, on child custody issues, it's the court that decides that. And Freeman, let's talk about it.
First, I'd like to step in because I get this question all the time, and I think it's important for people out there to understand that there's a difference between custody and placement. Most of the time, when you don't have any strong issues in a matter, joint custody is going to be a given. And what you're really fighting over isn't custody, it's placement, where the kids will spend their time. Will they be with their mother for, a week and then their father for a week, or will it be a standard visitation schedule, which is basically every other weekend and half the summers, half the holidays? So, I think people really need to understand the difference between joint custody and joint placement, or just custody and placement in general.
Yeah, and when you have joint placement, you're more likely to have an equal split of the time of the child with that parent. When you have a placement with one parent, then you have visitation, we call it, with the other parent. But, and oftentimes there are many factors that are used by a judge in deciding what to do with the placement of the children where it's contested. A lot of times the parents can reach an agreement on how to split the time up between the children. One thing I've noticed in the last few years is that men are more active in trying to have more time with their children than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was pretty standard that he got to see them sometime in the summer, as you mentioned, and every other weekend. But there have been some interesting things where they get them 3 days at a time, and sometimes even 4 days at a time. Any kind of thing you can imagine is possible. So why don't we talk a minute, and if you'll put the slide up, we'll talk about the considerations in deciding custody. Freeman, take over with this, and let's go through them.
The first factor to be considered is the age and sex of the child. So, typically, the younger the child, the more likely the court is going to believe that the child needs their mother. For instance, there could be breastfeeding going on. There could be all kinds of other things that the court can take into account when deciding a custody situation. 2, their emotional, social, moral, material, and educational needs. That's pretty self-explanatory. The 3rd is the respective home environment. So, do the mother or the father's home, does each child have their own bedroom? Is it kept clean? Do they have strange people around? And do they have family members that can help create a solid and stable environment for the children?
Or detract from one.
Or detract.
Let me interject this point too. The big standard in deciding child custody cases from the beginning is what is in the best interest of the child. The focus is on the child, not the parent. Most parents think it's on them, but it's not. And these factors that Freeman's going through are the things that the court considers in trying to arrive at a decision about what's in the best interest of the child. Now, if we go to the second slide there,
the 4th factor to consider is the characteristics of those seeking custody, including age, character, stability, mental and physical health. So if you have a history of mental illness or physical health problems that don't allow you, say you're disabled in some way and it would be much harder for you to take care of a small child, then your spouse would be more likely to have primary placement of the kids. The 5th is the fault of the parties in the divorce. So if you have a person seeking as grounds for divorce that the other party is addicted to drugs, and they can prove that in court, the person that is addicted to drugs will obviously have that factor taken into consideration and will greatly hurt them in a custody battle. 6, cruelty toward the children. 7, past care and custody of child, which basically means who has been the primary caregiver, who has gotten the children up, fed them breakfast, taken them to school, taken them to school functions, helped them with homework, things of that nature. 8, capacity of each parent to provide needs to the children. That's pretty self-explanatory. That kind of goes into that caregiver aspect. Who is more fit to provide the things the children need from a parent. 9 is the relationship between the child and parent. So if you have one parent that, for lack of a better term, is basically an absentee parent, they don't know that child that well, and the child is very close with the other parent, then most likely that child is going to go to the parent they feel the most comfortable with and have the closest relationship with. 10 is the preference of the child. Now this is a pretty complicated factor because the court is going to take into consideration the age, the maturity of the child, how well adjusted the child is. A lot of people believe or ask if there's a certain age at which point a child gets to make that decision.
We get that question all the time.
And there is not an age where the child gets to make the decision. You can have one child that's 12 years old but is very, very mature, and then you can have a child that's 14 or 15 that's very immature. And so it's more about the maturity of the child and the relationship that child has with the parents that will give their, what they would like, more weight with the court. If they make good grades and they're more mature, then they'll have more input.
We got 1 minute left. Can you modify custody once it's set?
Absolutely you can.
And what's the basis for doing that?
Well, you got change in circumstances. One party can be forced to move, one party can become unstable, can develop issues later on.
Anything that would affect the best interest of the child.
That's correct.
That's not what it's called. One final thing, how do they set child support? How is a child support set?
This is a common question, and basically there is a schedule where you put in both parties' gross incomes, and if you don't work, then you're going to be set at minimum wage. They get added together. There's a little bit of a formula which we can go over some other time when we have more time, but
it's a calculation made.
It's a calculation made by the state.
And that's set, and the judge orders it, and you rarely get a deviation. So we've enjoyed having you again tonight, watching our show on domestic issues. We'll see you next Wednesday night at 9:30.